Hello, today is the fifth Sunday of Easter. Our first reading is from Acts chapter 9, verses 26 to 31. Our psalm is Psalm 22. Our second reading is from the first epistle of John, chapter 3, verses 18 to 24. And our gospel comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verses 1 to 8. I love the Acts of the Apostles. All the great stories about the early church, the exploits of Peter and Paul and the other early leaders. In our reading today, Paul, still called Saul at this point, Paul comes to Jerusalem. Now this is after his conversion on the way to Damascus. In fact, he had stayed in Damascus for some time, preaching the truth of Jesus Christ, so much so that the Jews of Damascus wanted to kill him. So he came to Jerusalem, hoping to join up with the disciples, but they were afraid of him. Now, to be fair, he had just been trying to kill them, so the disciples were not really ready to believe that Paul was a changed man. But Barnabas stood up for him. He told the disciples all that Paul had been doing since his conversion, how God had spoken to Paul, called him away from his sin of persecution, how Paul had been boldly preaching and teaching in Damascus. I think Paul is a perfect example of what Jesus was talking about in our gospel today. I think Paul is exactly the kind of branch that Jesus alludes to. A branch that at first was not bearing fruit. Now there's no doubt that Paul was a branch in God's garden, a devout Jew, a member of the Pharisees, one of God's chosen people. And prior to Jesus coming onto the scene, Paul, as well as the other Jews, were the dominant religion in the region, at least the dominant religion that followed the one true God. Prior to Jesus, Paul would have been considered a great servant of God, a wonderful branch in God's garden. Because Paul was all in on the Old Testament, the ancient Hebrew traditions. He was loyal to the law of Abraham and Moses, loyal to a fault. So loyal that when he perceived a threat to God's law, to God's traditions, to God's institutional church, he resorted to any means necessary to stop the threat. When Jesus and his followers began to upend the social status quo in the Jewish community, when they began to question long-standing church doctrine, when they began to preach love, mercy, and forgiveness instead of sin, fire, and brimstone, Paul, called Saul, knew what had to be done, what he thought God would want him to do. So Paul set about rounding up Christians to be killed. He held the coats for the murderers that stoned St. Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Paul was on his way to Damascus, in fact, to continue his murderous defense of his traditions, of his beliefs, of his understanding of God's will. Paul was on his way as a branch in God's garden, cleaning out the unworthy and the undesirable, those that he perceived as damaging the integrity of his church. He was on his way, a powerful branch, when he got pruned, cut down, removed from the vine, as it were. He was on his way, and a light from the sky flashed all around him, and he fell to the ground. And as he lay in the dirt on the road to Damascus, like a branch cut off from the vine, as he lay there, a voice from heaven, God's voice, said, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And Saul said, "Who are you?" And the reply came, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Can you imagine the confusion, the bewilderment that Paul must have felt, the heart-wrenching guilt he must have experienced as he realized all the innocent blood he had helped to shed, all the lives lost and disrupted in his zeal to preserve the tradition, his misguided attempt to protect God from those who he perceived as a threat, those who went against the tradition, those new voices advocating for change, those voices led by the voice of Jesus, preaching love and mercy. You see, righteous murder, if there could be such a thing, feels so much better for the murderer than regular old killing. And righteous religious persecution feels so much better for the persecutor than just plain old persecution. It must have been a deeply distressing moment for Paul. The guilt could easily have consumed him. So what did he do? He did not remain a branch that does not bear fruit, cut off and thrown into the fire. That's never God's plan for any of us. Paul remained in Jesus. From that moment on, he believed and he followed and he remained in Jesus and bore much fruit. Maybe more fruit than anybody. Now, he wasn't always popular. People tried to kill him almost everywhere he went, because Jesus' message of love and mercy was a threat then, just as the message is a threat now. And those who would defend their tradition against Jesus' message were ruthless and unyielding and formidable then, just as they are now. But Paul persevered. Through it all, he grew in faith and understanding, and he produced much fruit. So how did he get past the evil that he had done in persecuting the Christians? How did Paul not remain face down in the dirt? How did he manage to end up as a well-pruned branch on the vine, producing much fruit? Well, it starts with a simple understanding of a simple concept that the Apostle John lays out for us in our second reading today. Paul forgave himself as Jesus did, and he kept God's commandment. He didn't let his heart condemn him. He didn't let his own guilt overwhelm him. He didn't hold on to his guilt at the expense of doing God's will in his life. Paul got past the guilt and self-condemnation in his heart because, as John wrote, God is greater than our hearts, and he knows everything. If our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence in God and receive from him whatever we ask, because we keep his commandments and do what pleases him. And his commandment is this: we should believe in the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another just as he commanded us. Those who keep his commandments remain in him. That's how Paul did it, how he remained in Christ and bore much fruit despite his checkered past. He believed in Jesus and he loved his neighbors. Over and over, we keep getting this same commandment from Jesus, reiterated here by John, lived out by Paul. But so often we can't get past the rest of it, past our own checkered history, our own Catholic guilt of our perceived shortcomings. So often we want to cling to something more than love, mercy, and forgiveness. We struggle to be like Paul. Our hearts condemn us, and we end up wallowing in guilt rather than bearing much fruit. When we're laying there in the dirt, the way Paul was, after we've been pruned, cut off from the vine, made aware of our shortcomings, God will speak to us, as he did to Paul. Like he told Paul, he will tell us, get up. He told Paul to go on to Damascus, and he will tell us also where to go, who to see, how to be healed, as Paul was, how to serve the Lord, as Paul did. But if we just lay there, don't heed the instruction to get up and carry on with God's plan, if we give up on ourselves, well, then we will never bear any fruit for the kingdom. We will woe is me and my sin, or woe is you and your sin, until kingdom come, and we'll have nothing to show for it. God is greater than our hearts. If he forgives us, then who are we to cling to condemnation? Who are we to remain as a branch, cut off from the vine in the pruning process? Who are we to remain outside of Christ's plan? Who are we to not bear much fruit for the vineyard? Who are we to ignore God's plan for our lives? And who are we to ignore his forgiveness?